Today I want to talk about Stephen King's Misery. I just finished this book and I have some notes here. So if you see me glancing down, I'm probably looking at my notes. I have a lot of things I want to talk about this book, and I'm probably not going to remember all of them even with the notes I have jotted down here. They're just kind of jumbled here on a piece of paper. I'm probably not going to be going in this very specific order, but I'm going to try to remember everything I wanted to say about this book. So, to be honest, I wasn't super excited to read this one. I more so wanted to read this book just because of how many good things I've heard about it. I've watched a lot of reviews on it, or read a lot of reviews. I've been aware of the movie for some time, even though I haven't seen it yet. And it seems to be like a very popular book of his. Many fans claim it to be one of his best works. So yeah, I was just decided to check this one out and see what it's all about. So I'm going to get into the plot a little bit of this one. I'm not going to spoil it or go too far, but essentially the main character of this book, his name is Paul Sheldon. He's driving through this secluded town, just kind of in the middle of nowhere, just a small town. And he's drunk. He's drinking and driving, which is obviously not good. And it's also winter out to make matters worse. The roads are snowy and covered in ice. And naturally, his car spins and he manages to drive into a ditch. His car flips, I believe it's upside down or whatever. And this woman comes along named Annie Wilkes, and she basically rescues him from the wreck. This Annie Wilkes character, if it's not obvious, from her being able to drag him from the car. She's a very, hefty, strong woman. She somehow manages to carry him from his car and put him into her own vehicle and drive him home, which she does. And she manages to put him in her guest bedroom and take care of his broken legs. Paul broke both of his legs in this wreck, and she splints them up a little bit. She gives him some drugs, some painkillers. She kind of takes care of him a little bit. And Paul wakes up, and he's a little bit groggy. Of course, he doesn't really know what's going on right away. Where am I? What's going on here? And then Annie comes in when he wakes up, and I don't remember how long he's asleep for. I believe it's a while. I don't think he wakes up, right away. I think he's there for a couple days or something, or even a week maybe. I don't remember. And he wakes up, and Annie explains to him that he was in this car wreck. He broke his legs. She took care of him. She fixed his legs up the best she could and gave him these drugs, on and on and on. And it's also revealed that Annie is also a huge fan of his. She's read all of his books. Paul Sheldon is this very famous author, and she's read all of his books. She has all of his books, and she basically is in love with the guy. So Paul starts to kind of silently question exactly what's going on here. He detects immediately that something is not right about the scenario. He starts asking himself, why am I not in a hospital? Why did she bring me to her house? This woman does not seem right. Something kind of fishy is going on here. And it turns out that Annie happens to be reading the last book that Paul wrote, which is part of this book series involving this main character named Misery. So this book kind of has this story within a story element to it. And as she finishes reading this book and she comes into his room, Annie is very, very angry, because at the end of this book, the main character Misery dies. So Annie goes into this fit of rage, just screaming at Paul and asking him why he would kill her. How could he do such a thing? Because Annie is just so wrapped up in these characters and involved or immersed into these books that he wrote that she basically is believing them like they're real almost. And she views these books and this act of writing as sacred. So obviously Annie is not right in the head. There's a few different terms thrown around in here, and this book definitely does explore that psychological side of things. I don't remember what category Annie falls under, but I believe she's called neurotic and psychotic at times. I can't remember which one she leans more towards. But anyway, after this little event takes place of her screaming at him, what happens from there is things essentially start to go downhill. Things escalate quickly as we see the dark side of this crazy lady. And essentially she demands of him to write another book in this series while he's laying in bed, held captive, drugged up from the painkillers and everything with 2 broken legs. She demands of him that he writes another book exactly how she wants it to, basically. Not exactly. He does kind of write his own story, but she basically forces him to write this book. And if he doesn't, then more bad things might happen to him besides just broken legs. So I won't get into it any more than that. That's the plot, essentially, for those of you who aren't familiar with this book. But I would assume a lot of you already are, since this book is a little bit older and as popular as it is. So anyway, like I said, I have some notes here and I have a lot of things I wanted to talk about this book. I probably won't get to them all because I probably just won't remember everything. But I'm going to talk about what I really liked about this book, and then I'm going to kind of move on to some cons, some negative things about this book. But yeah, let's get into it. So the main thing that I really liked about this book, and I feel like is the book's strongest aspect, is the inner monologue of Paul, his thoughts. A lot of the book, probably like half the book almost, to be honest, is spent in Paul's thoughts. We get this very intimate, very personal experience through Paul's inner monologue as he goes through this scenario of being held captive by this psychopathic woman. And it feels just very vivid and believable. And while the premise itself, I wasn't necessarily buying into all that much. Like, what are the odds, you're going to get into a car wreck and your number one fan is going to rescue you and essentially torture you into, writing another book. Like, it seems a little bit far-fetched for my tastes, but everything that happens in here feels extremely grounded, extremely realistic. We have very human characters in here with very human flaws. Everything feels very believable. And as we're reading this book through Paul's point of view, it just gives us this very close look through his eyes of what's happening as we get into his head. And it almost makes you feel like you're right there beside Paul with him, almost like you're in his shoes experiencing this happen with him. Now, I think part of why this is done so well is Stephen King went through something very similar himself. He kind of went through his own experience, very much like what happens in here, obviously without the crazy fan. I don't remember the whole story, so I won't talk about it too much and potentially get the facts wrong, but I do remember reading that Stephen King was in an accident himself, and he was disabled for a while, and I believe he was hooked on drugs, strong painkillers, that kind of thing for a very long time. Please correct me down in the comments if I'm wrong. I don't remember the whole story, so I won't talk about it too much. But it feels like Stephen King is writing from a very personal experience with this book, making it feel just all the more believable and just very clear and vivid. So I think that's part of why it's done so well here, because it almost feels like this actually happened. Another thing I really liked about this book is the psychological aspect to it. I was not expecting that. Going into this, I was just kind of expecting more of a straightforward thriller where this guy is held captive by this crazy lady, forcing him to write this book. But there's a lot of psychological elements going on here. And as the book progresses, we get to witness this kind of decline in Paul's mental health as this character Annie starts to wear off on him after a while. We start to see further and further into Annie's mind and, in some cases, lack of her soul, I guess. I don't know. Basically, we get to see this darker side of her where she's lacking human emotion, and her mental health is just kind of all over the place, and just how unstable she is, I guess I'm trying to say. And it starts to really wear on Paul after a while. He's with this character for a very long time. And we get to witness this kind of decline, this almost, not quite, but almost descent into madness as Paul himself starts going a little bit crazy and his thoughts become more disjointed and jumbled. And there are times, without spoiling anything, there are times earlier in the book where he thinks about trying to escape and tries making plans to retaliate against Annie and tries to figure out what he's going to do. And after a while, as the story kind of progresses and Annie becomes more aggressive and more unstable, Paul kind of sees how futile and how helpless he really is. And he starts to resort to this book he's writing for Annie. He kind of uses that as his own crutch and just kind of not really gives up, but he kind of gives up on the idea of trying to escape and tries to get lost in this book he's writing, and in the joy of writing it, he becomes consumed with this own story that he's writing and fascinated by it, and is kind of using that as a distraction to basically keep himself sane. Because if it wasn't for this book that he was writing, there's no telling what would have happened to Paul. He probably would have, done something very bad to himself or just gone insane. But yeah, so that's kind of an interesting factor. I was really not expecting there to be this deep psychological exploration of both characters simultaneously, Annie and Paul. So I really like that aspect of the book. And it certainly runs very deep too. I feel like there's a lot you could analyze there. Another thing I really liked about this book too is just how smart and intelligent it is because of this story within a story element that's going on here. This book feels like it's almost, I don't want to say self-aware, but almost kind of self-aware at times. There's this very focus on the art of writing itself and just books and the contrast between fiction and reality. And there's a lot going on here that I feel like you could really analyze. And there's almost this little bit of humor and irony going on throughout the story as Paul muses over his own books and his own misery story that he's writing. And there were times where, for example, where I would be thinking just how vivid and how believable this all is and how well written this book is, especially in regards to Paul's inner monologue. But for example, of what I mean about like the humor and stuff and the irony is I would be thinking along those lines, I'm like, wow, like this is just crazy, just very clear, this picture and this situation. It feels so believable. And then Paul would start thinking about how vivid his imagination is, things along those lines, and about how this is absolutely bonkers and things like this shouldn't happen in real life. This should only happen in books. So there's this little bit of like humor and irony kind of going on throughout. And there's also many references to literature throughout this book. And it almost goes a little bit too far. I'm going to back up a little bit here. There were times in this book where I was very immersed into the story. There were moments of nail-biting suspense and tension. And it was some of the most tense, I don't know. It was some of just the most suspenseful moments I've read in a book in a long, long time. And it worked very well. But there were also times where I feel like he might have teetered towards the edge of going too far with the references and stuff towards writing, and Paul musing over the contrast between the things that happen in his books and what's happening to him personally, things like that. And it just almost felt like it was kind of breaking the fourth wall. Not quite, but it was kind of teetering towards that line. And I would say it slightly ruined the immersion aspect for me because I was just kind of amused by those little whimsical trains of thought and things of that nature. So as much as I really enjoyed this book and was just surprised at how well written it is, there were some things that I didn't like about it. One of them was, as much as I was talking about how Paul's thoughts and getting this like close-up personal experience in the book by reading about his thoughts and spending this time with him, making it feel like you're right there with him, like in his shoes. I feel like it does take things a little bit too far at times, and I feel like this kind of goes hand in hand with his musings on writing and his own works and things like that. I feel like it's a little bit of a slog to get through at times, as we spend just so much time in his thoughts, and it feels like there's more time spent reading about what he's thinking than what's actually happening in the story. And it gets a little bit confusing, especially towards the end of the book, more towards like the second half and the end. There's also these kind of confusing time lapses that take place, and I think this is done intentionally, but it was a little bit confusing. I think it's intentional because we start to see Paul's mental and emotional health start falling apart even more, and I think it's meant to kind of create this sense of disorientation for us and make us feel just kind of as lost as he is, and just kind of increase this sense of just helplessness and despair, because that's really what the situation is like that he's in, is just feel so helpless. Like, what can he do? You know, he's being held captive by Annie Wilkes, and he's stuck writing the story and sees no other way of escape or survival other than to write the story. Of course, writing it is not only just to keep him alive, but it's also to keep him sane, as it gives him something to distract himself, something to focus on. So yeah, like I said, there's a lot of interesting psychological elements going on here. But the time lapses towards the second half of the book, as it kind of jumps around. It's a little bit confusing, but like I said, I think part of that is intentional, so I can't knock the book too much for doing that. Let's see. Another thing that I didn't really like about this book, and again, I feel like this isn't something either that I can take away any points for, is the story within the story element. So I mentioned that Paul is writing this misery book for Annie, and we get actual text from the misery book in here. Long chunks of text, like several pages of him actually writing the misery story on his typewriter, and it's actually in like the Courier font, I believe is what it is, that the typewriters were set in. And it's kind of interesting to see that, and I understand the necessity of having that in the story for seeing that story progress, and it is kind of important to the plot of what happens in this story with this book. But it still made reading those chunks a little bit boring in my opinion, and I was just kind of trying to hurry up and get through them so I could get back to the actual story, not the story within the story. But I do understand why they're in there. Like I said, I guess I can't take away too many points or knock the book too much for having those in there, because it all makes sense, and towards the end it's all wrapped up, and it's very clear why Stephen King decided to include those blocks of text from Paul's misery story in here. One thing I will say real quick too that I find very interesting is the typewriter that Paul is using is kind of falling apart. It has a couple of missing letters, and he has to fill in by hand with a pencil the missing letters on the pages once he's untyping them. And the missing letter, one of them is an N. I noticed in the font of this book that every N is different to give it the appearance that he's actually writing it by hand, which I'm assuming he actually did write these N's out by hand, Stephen King or somebody, because I was looking at them closely, and literally every single letter N within the block of text of this misery story is unique. None of them are the same. I thought maybe right away that they just used several different fonts to kind of give that illusion, but no, I believe they are all written by hand, which to me is just crazy, the amount of dedication that went into this book, and just, again, how smart and intelligent it was. And what's interesting to me is how more letters continue to fall out of this typewriter as the story progresses, and he has to keep writing them or filling them in by hand, the missing letters. So I hope I'm not confusing you too much. I hope this is making sense, talking about the story within the story. But I found that to be a very interesting aspect because it kind of resembles, or I should say represents, this deterioration of Paul's mental health and his emotional health as this typewriter is slowly falling apart and the letters coming off of it as the story progresses. And it kind of represents how he is slowly falling apart as well. There's just a lot of interesting things in here that you could really analyze with this book. And at the end of the day, I feel like my appreciation for Misery runs deeper than my actual enjoyment of it. Now, like I said, there were times I was really immersed in this book, and there were some really great moments of like suspense in here and just tension that had me just having to know what happens next. But there were also times where I feel like that immersion was broken by just how self-aware the book really feels and how much Paul thinks about writing itself and the contrast between books and real life. And I almost felt like it was just a little bit too much at times. But one thing that I do want to mention too, I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit here, but one thing I want to mention is this book had me looking up the definitions of several words that I may have encountered before, but I don't really remember. And I was kind of surprised by that because it's not very often I come across many words in a single book that I don't know the meaning of, and I have to pause to look up what the word means. Occasionally, there will be one, maybe two words in a book, like every other book that I read, that I'll have to look up the meaning of. This book had several, but I'm going to read you a couple sentences in here that were very confusing to me. An odd stony look had come into her face. He did not like this mullishness, this almost ostentatious look of obduration. When I first read that, I was like, what the hell does that even mean? So I believe I have seen, or may have seen, these words before, but I wasn't too familiar with their meaning, so I had to pause to look them up. And even after looking up the definitions of these words, this particular sentence was still very vague to me. I've never seen such a dense and just kind of vague description of somebody's expression on their face. Like, is something that should be so simple, Stephen King describes as being a look of ostentatious obduration. So when I read that, I was just kind of confused as why he would choose to do that. To me, it felt like a little bit too much. I don't know why. I just wanted to mention that quick. I think it's kind of funny, but yeah, I had to look up the definition of those words and refresh myself with what they meant. And there were other words throughout this book that I also had to look up the definition of. That wasn't the only one. I just wanted to mention that quick. So overall, as I was saying, I feel like my appreciation for this book runs a little bit deeper. One other thing too is I feel like because of how fascinated I was by this book, just how well crafted it is and how deep and meaningful it is, really, is I felt like I was almost trying to analyze it to the point where I wasn't enjoying the story as much. Like, I was trying to pick up on all these little things and kind of peel back these layers that this book has. Like, there's a lot going on here. This is not just your run-of-the-mill, simple thriller. The premise of Paul Sheldon being kidnapped by this obsessive fan is not the only thing going on in this book. There's a lot going on here that I feel like you could analyze and take away from. There's a lot of thought-provoking stuff in here. And yeah, like I said, I was kind of fascinated by it, and it really surprised me. But like I said, it got to be a little bit too much at times as I was thinking about all of these things, and I wasn't becoming as immersed in the story towards like the second half and towards the end as much as I was early on, as we explore these different themes regarding the psychological elements and how closely this book resembles just real life, like the things Stephen King went through, the things we all go through as writers. This character, Annie Wilkes, is not just a villain, but she's kind of symbolic of these deep, like, challenges that we go through as writers in order to I don't know, I guess, accomplish what we're trying to. Like, we have to go through these very difficult hardships in order to come out stronger and come out with, like, I don't know, you guys know what I'm trying to say. Obviously this meant something very specific to Stephen King, but I feel like it's left a little bit open to interpretation. You might have your own Annie Wilkes in your life if you're an aspiring writer like myself, and in order to become a better writer, you might have to overcome this challenge. You might have to defeat this psychotic voice inside yourself telling you that you're not good enough, or something along those lines. It's kind of left open to interpretation. Like I said, I know I struggle a lot as a writer, and with having confidence and feeling like my writing is never going to be good enough. So I really connected with a lot of the things in this book. Very relatable. And even though the very premise is a little bit far-fetched, yeah, I don't know. This, like I said, I was just really fascinated by this book. I really appreciate it. I feel like this is almost a work of art just as much as it is like a thriller novel. So yeah, overall, I'm going to give this book a 3.5 stars. I kind of struggled with the rating a little bit because as many good things as I'm saying about this book, I don't feel like I loved it. I really, really enjoyed it. I thought this was a great book. Like I said, it's very smart, very intelligent, very tense and suspenseful at times, very nail-biting. But I don't feel like I was just in love with the book. I wasn't immersed the entire time. I did have a few small issues with it, which mostly weren't huge issues, but nonetheless, they kind of hindered my experience slightly. So I just decided to go with 3.5 stars out of 5, which is still a pretty good rating. Even a 3-star rating to me means I liked the book. I enjoyed it. And 3.5 stars I feel like is pretty solid. When I first read, I'm just going to use this kind of as a comparison, I guess. When I first read The Troop by Nick Cutter, I believe I read that book like a month ago or a couple months ago. I don't remember. I'd give that one a 3.5 out of 5 stars. And that book really like impacted me. That one really stuck in my memory, just how gruesome it is and grotesque and violent. Like, that book really blew me away, and I was really immersed into that story, probably more so than this one, at least on more of a consistent basis anyway. This one had its moments where I was very just pulled in, but The Troop, I feel like I was more immersed into overall throughout the entirety of that book. And I give that one a 3.5 stars initially too, and I really enjoyed that one for the most part. So yeah, I just basically what I'm trying to say is 3.5 stars is not a bad rating. I know it might seem contradictory to some of you. I know we all have our own rating systems. But yeah, I was just kind of trying to use that as like a comparison. The Troop I ended up rounding up to 4 stars. I could probably give this book a 4 stars too, to be honest. But I'm not sure if this is one I will continue to reread in the future. And that's the thing. That's one of the things I take into consideration when I'm reading books. Is this a book that I loved enough to where I will want to reread this in the future, possibly reread it multiple times? And as much as I did really like this book, again, and was fascinated by how well crafted it was, I'm not entirely sure this is a book I can see myself rereading. Part of that is just because I'm not really sure. I think part of it is just because it was a little bit of a slog to get through at times. I think we spent, even though this is part of the book's, or one of the book's strongest aspects in my eyes, I feel like we did spend too much time in his thoughts, just a little bit, and didn't get enough narration of the actual events occurring. And it was a little bit of a slog to get through in the sense that this book was very just helpless feeling, very dark, almost kind of like Nick Cutter's The Troop. It didn't make it a very enjoyable experience because of just how grim this book is. It's very grim, honestly. It's the best way I can think to describe it. So, yeah, at the end of the day, 3.5 stars is still a good rating. I still really enjoyed this book. Honestly, out of everything that I've read by Stephen King up to this point, I think this is his best work. This is a very well-written novel. I'm not saying it's my personal favorite. I'm not saying that at all. But I believe this is his best work that I've read of him so far. I have yet to read some of his other classics like The Shining. I'll probably get to that one eventually. I do have a copy of The Shining. But I would recommend this book to most people, I would say. Almost anybody. Even if you're not a huge fan of horror or thrillers like myself, this book, I feel like everyone should read this at least once.